Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nwankpa. Today we're going to be exploring an important subject, looking at Liberia's post-conflict situation, looking at the progress it's made so far in its political history. Today I am joined by a special guest, Dr. Christine Cheng. Dr. Cheng is a senior lecturer at the War Department at King's College, London. She is the author of the award-winning book, Extra-Legal Groups in Post-Conflict Liberia, How Trade Makes the State, and also author of several other books, including Securing and Sustaining Elite Bargains that Reduce Violent Conflict. Dr. Cheng also has worked with several international organizations, including the United Nations and the World Bank, and she regularly comments on several media outlets, including BBC, Al Jazeera, and Wall Street Journal. Christine, I'm very, very delighted to have you today, and I look forward to an interesting conversation.
Me too. It's really nice to be here with you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I'm going to start off by asking you, in the last 40 years or 40 something years, we've seen Liberia, a country of like 5 million people, if I'm correct, go through from military coup to two civil wars, and then we've seen also transition to the democratic state, where we've seen two successive democratic transition. So looking at that history of violence, how much progress would you say Liberia has made so far that's from the 70s when our talking is till now?
I think Liberia has made a tremendous amount of progress, and I think the country should be incredibly proud of how far it has come, given its past and all of the difficulties of the civil wars, and even emerging out of the civil wars. There were some periods where it wasn't clear whether or not the country was going to go back to war, and instead, it has come out the other end. It's had a number of elections now, all with peaceful results from 2005 onwards until the very latest one now, and they have all been incredibly successful. So with a little bit of controversy at different times, but not with the latest one and not with the previous one. And I think that's something that we should actually all be celebrating, given how difficult things have been in West Africa with the recent spate of coups that have taken place. So you can't actually take a peaceful election in West Africa for granted anywhere in the region. And Liberia has come out the other side and everybody agrees that it was a very peaceful and successful election. So, an incredible amount to be proud of.
Hmm. Amazing, amazing. Speaking of the elections, and speaking of how it has been relatively been free, fair, and transparent, and then looking at connecting or relating that to elections in other African countries, and how we've experienced violence, and so would we, on one hand, would you say Liberia offers some sort of hope to what I call liberal form of democracy and elections? And on the other hand, what is it that has changed? Because in the past, from the 80s before 2005, the tussle for power struggle in Liberia, was one of the reasons why they had, the civil wars in the first instance. So what has changed? You did talk about, in your other book, you talk about elite bargains. Does that play a role in the shifts in Liberia? And how does Liberia offers um, a sort of like an example or something that other West African countries can look up to in terms of elections?
Well, I mean, this is a complicated question with a complicated answer, but I would say that, um, there are some things that have made Liberia's situation maybe a little bit more resilient to what has happened. Um, and I can point to a few of these things, but I wouldn't say that that it's 100% clear why Liberia is doing better than some other countries when it comes to dealing with unrest and unhappiness in the population. And I would say largely in the places where you have had coups, the situation, the day-to-day situation is pretty bad. And
Mm,
that's the number one driver of when you you end up with political instability, right?
mm,
It is often speaking to a situation where it's not just about the elite; it's also often about the people. There is a reflection of the country not working, right? You don't
mm,
tend to. This is very rare, much more rare, where things are working very, very well and everything's going well. You don't tend
mm,
to see coups in African countries where everything is going well. You tend to see them
mm,
where things are going badly. So,
mm,
so thinking about those ground conditions is, I think, generally important. It's not that things have been going super well in Liberia either, though, right? So that's not unusual. And of course, Liberia itself has had a history of very uncertain political forces, including its own coup back
mm,
with Samuel Doe when he took over in 1980, and kicking out a very, very long tradition of um, the Whig Party being in power and changing over from Congo/American rule. But, you know, then there was all of the violence that followed. And then out of that, there was a long period where there was an international presence. There was also a lot of attention paid to Liberia. So even though,
mm,
even after the peacekeepers left, there are a lot of eyes on Liberia, right? And I
mm,
think having eyes on a country where some people care, right? Having people from the outside world actually care and pay attention, that also gives you some protection. Um,
mm,
and the economy was doing relatively well for a period in West Africa, or sorry, in Liberia from, I would say, 2005. Even last year in Liberia, they say economic growth was about 5%. So,
mm,
there's all of that, but there's still a lot of grinding poverty with people living below $2 a day on average. I mean, I don't think that those estimates are necessarily entirely accurate because it doesn't account for all sorts of informal activity in the economy. But having said that, it's still an incredibly poor country. You just leave Monrovia and you see the poverty everywhere, and how hard it is. So you get those kinds of conditions, and then you think, well, how do people express their anger? And there are lots of different ways to do that. One is, through the voting box and with your ballot. And if you feel like that ballot is actually going to change something in your life, and actually that when you vote, it's not going to be just tossed away and whoever is designated to win is going to win anyway, then you can use the ballot box, right? Do you think that you can trust your system so that if the person that you want to win is actually going to be allowed to win, then you will be more likely to trust that system. If you think that the election is going to be rigged and that it doesn't matter what you do at the ballot box, that the person who is designated to win and the system is so corrupt that there's no point in trying, then you think, okay, I can't do it through nonviolent means. Maybe I can protest in the streets. If I can't do that either, if it's, say, being shut down or you feel like it's too dangerous to do that, then, then other people you get this unrest in the country. And then the question is, what do you do with that unrest, right? So in some cases, you see a social movement coming and taking over in a place like Sudan, and the al-Bashir is kicked out, and the military junta, the regime there is kicked out as well. And then you see a back and forth over the years. And in Sudan, sadly, the military's come back, right? And in other cases, you see the military itself saying, okay, this is not acceptable. These people are corrupt. And then they do what they do and they think they might do a better job, or maybe it is a power grab. But I think that question that you ask is a really good one, right? Why are some places more protected? How do you, quote unquote, coup-proof a country that might be more susceptible? And I think part of that has to do with the economy. Part of that has to do with the outside world caring. It used to also be another important factor was that in Africa there was a general sort of rule that you wouldn't let the leaders come to the big meetings with the African Union and ECOWAS and so forth if they had taken control by coups. And now it seems like, that norm has changed. There are so many countries that have gone through these coups. And so you see this norm shifting, right? So people are not taking as hard a line on it anymore. You can see just within what ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, that the response from other presidential leaders has been different, right? There was talk of Nigeria being more active when the coup in Niger happened, and then all of a sudden, everybody pulled back from that. So you see this kind of people are more wary of getting involved now. And that makes it then again more okay if you're thinking about taking over a country from the military side. You think, oh, they didn't do anything about it in these other places. And so you're emboldened, right? Yeah.
Oh, amazing. You've mentioned quite a number of things there. When you mention Niger and other countries, like in the Francophone countries that are experiencing coup now, and then you look at ECOWAS and ECOWAS' inability to, despite setting several, if I would call it, red lines, and then didn't have, couldn't do anything. Well, in the 90s, surprisingly, when Liberia was going through some of the civil war, we had ECOMOG, the ECOWAS military were able to, intervened in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. Why has ECOWAS, why have they lost that ability or power, or that, I call it, moral ground? I don't know if I was going to call it that moral case to be able to, because in Niger, one of the arguments was coming off the back of Nigeria's troubled election itself, and the issue of legitimacy on the president itself. The people are like, you don't have the moral ground to do this. So what has that changed? In Liberia, able to say, what has changed? This is a bit outside of Liberia, but looking at how these cases can also incentivize, other countries to do the same? What has changed from the 90s
Oh, you're
where
asking tough questions here. And I think, well, you're asking questions like with really, I think, complicated backstories, right? So, if you look back to why Nigeria was able to play such a powerful role in the case of both Sierra Leone and in Liberia with ECOMOG. So this is the Economic Community of West African States, and then shortened to the monitoring group bit of it, which effectively wasn't just monitoring, it came in and acted, I would say, actually as a party to the conflict in a lot of cases, right? So they were in theory supposed to be peacekeeping, but in order to be doing this kind of peacekeeping, they had to be um, offensive at times as much as defensive, and they ended up embroiled in the conflict themselves, and that complicated things, right? With a variety, mostly Nigerians, right, but with a little bit of help from Gambia, a little bit of help from Ghana, and so forth. Right? So, but mostly it was Nigerian troops who were on the ground and active there. And you're asking, why was Liberia, or sorry, why would it go in or were willing to go in? I think there were, in Liberia's case, certainly there was a personal um, relationship that was going on there, and a personal animosity as well. So the personal relationship was with Doe, between um, the president at the time, and then Nigerian president and Samuel Doe, and then there was a personal animosity that was between um, the Nigerian president and Charles Taylor at the time. And that was because, and this is super fascinating, um, it was because during the coup in, um, it was during the coup, and Doe was not willing to save um, Daisy de la Fosse, who was the daughter-in-law. Oh, no, sorry, maybe I'm thinking about in Côte d'Ivoire. I'm thinking about in Côte d'Ivoire, why
Yeah, that's
people were
right.
willing to intervene in that particular case, so I'm mixing things up right now. But all that to say that, there's often a history between, the states here and how they are dealing with each other, and the relationships are quite personal, um, and so some of that comes into play when thinking about whether or not to intervene, right? And
Mm, mm,
there are still personal relationships now, but the whole tenor of whether or not it's okay to intervene. Think about how we felt about intervention right after, and this would have been just very shortly after the Gulf War. So this is the
mm,
early 1990s, and also how people felt about democracy at the time, right?
mm,
That
mm,
people had hope that if we could preserve democracy, um, then and the hope for a future democracy in a place like
mm,
Liberia, that you can't just have these coups take place, right?
mm,
So
mm,
that, I think, also changed the dynamic of what was happening. So you get the kind of geopolitical conditions, and now you think about what's going on now and how many
mm,
failed interventions there have been around the
mm,
world. And I'm sure that Nigeria is looking at the situation and thinking, do I really want to get involved again? Because don't forget,
mm.
when they did get involved in the 1990s in Liberia, um, they were sort of burned by that, right? That
Yeah.
there was this whole period where lots and lots of Nigerian soldiers were being killed in this mission, and it was
Mm,
a really bloody battle. I don't know that
mm.
the Nigerian population would be willing, to
To support.
suffer that again,
Mm,
right? So from the kind of domestic constituency side, maybe there is actually, you know, more democratic accountability within Nigeria, and so the president is paying more attention to how the people feel. Whereas I think,
Mm.
back in the 1990s, it they might not have needed to do that in the same way. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I mean, this
Yeah,
is I think
it's
this
quite
is just
interesting
a
because it's quite
different
interesting
change in
because you
time,
mentioned.
right? Different change.
Yeah, I agree with you. One of the things you've not mentioned that I think you're looking to mention, you mentioned it kind of like very it's that notion of or the idea of or the way democracy was perceived at the time, and I think it was at the back end of the end of the Cold War, and then there was new this third wave of democratization, and then there was this rush to like spread liberal democracy and all of that. But I think what's happening now is also over that period of maybe 30 years in the continent, you've seen a disillusionment with democracy. Democracy hasn't yielded that much democracy, that much dividend, which again you then look at it in terms of um uh state building, looking at the political culture of African continent itself, how the state is being built. And I'm going to take you to what you said in your book when you were looking at how you were challenging our construction of non-state actors, seeing them as a national threat. So you're kind of like reimagining them as you call them accidental state builders in an evolutionary state making process, rather than simply as a national threat. So I wanted you to expatiate on this and see how there could be behind all of this conflict we have, there could be a genuine um, or legitimate worry against the failure of democracy, which some people can capitalize on and exploit. But there is that legitimate to expand on that notion, on that reimagination of non-state conflict groups, and especially in Liberia as well.
So you want me to comment on thinking about
Yeah.
these non-state groups as potential state builders?
Yes, yes, yes. Because
So
it
which
could be a
groups are you
case of
thinking about?
so I'm thinking about,
Oh,
so
you
if
mean
you look, go on.
no, go on, go on, go on.
Yeah, because you did make a difference. So I wanted to that's going to be my next question, but it kind of ties in as well. You did make a difference between warlords from extra legal groups and from mafias and all of this concept, but I wanted to, I know you made that distinction, you made that, but at times it's not very clear to people what those differences are. How do you differentiate between a warlord and an extra legal group? And are you in a way excusing the violence they might have committed in the past, and say that's just for the sake of state building? Should we just not look at what they've done?
Um, so I think about what I call those extra legal groups, and really in the case of Liberia, I was thinking about the ex-combatant groups that sometimes were made up largely of one armed group or one bit of Charles Taylor's militias and Charles Taylor's army.
Mm.
And then sometimes they would reconstitute, and sometimes they would sort of, just scatter to different parts of Liberia and then take over these natural resource areas, right? So I was talking about how they operated in different parts of Liberia when they took over particular resource enclaves, like a rubber plantation or a gold mining area or a diamond mining area or a timber area. Um,
Mm.
and so when I was writing about them, the thing that I was thinking about was, you know, you look at these groups like in person, and they don't necessarily look particularly dangerous. And and this is sometimes they were, and sometimes it was less clear what they were, right? Like that
Mm.
part of I think what we forget and I'm analyzing this through the lens of somebody from the West. And the narrative that we have about people who fight in these wars is that they, especially African ones, right, is that they are entirely brutal. And once you have fought in a war and killed somebody or done whatever it is that you've done, that there is no way back, right? That once you have done that thing, that forever you are tainted. And I think the story is often more it's more complicated than that. And I think what I wasn't happy about in that narrative was that there was no the story wasn't as complicated as it needed to be, that there was no taking into account that people then had to make a living afterwards, that they could have different lives, that they could, um, be miners and be laborers and try to make a living, and then think about, well, how does the country move beyond that? That I think when from the outside, a place like Liberia just looks like an incredibly brutal place, and that's the end of the story, right? That you have all these atrocities happening, and that there can't be anything more after that. That like it's almost like the country has it's just forever tainted. And I think I wasn't happy about that narrative once I got to the country, and you can see that there is a kind of, people trying to make something out of something very desperate, and then thinking about, well, how does that happen and why does it happen? And it's not to excuse what people have done, um, by any means. And I would be the first person to say there should be a reckoning. And it's up to the Liberian people to decide what that reckoning should look like, whether they think there should be trials. There was a TRC. I don't think it was wholly satisfactory for a lot of people. There are other ways in which people have tried to reconcile with the things that were done. But the things that I was talking about in terms of, the economic side of this was thinking about in these places, the state, right? If we think about the state was not necessarily a better actor, a more responsible actor, a more generous or caring actor. It's not like the state necessarily, the government itself was doing anything for a lot of these people in these places, right? So the what are you can't compare against a state in which this kind of theoretical magical state where everything works and services are being provided, and security works, the police works, and everything works, and then compare it to these groups, some of whom were, like I said, made up of ex-combatants, right? um, and then say, oh, well, one is good and the other is bad, because that first thing that I described doesn't exist, right? A lot of times the state itself, especially under Charles Taylor, was so incredibly abusive that people would rather have no state than have any version of that. And the question is, in some cases, were some of these groups able to bring a level of stability and order so that people could actually do business? And from that, right, I talked about the foundation, through which you set somebody is able to set some rules. And yes, maybe that looks like an authoritarian version, which I'm not particularly a fan of. But maybe even within that space, there is more give and take between the people and the person who is ruling over you. And then over time, you see that there is more give and take between the community and then the people who are ruling over you. And then over time, the state maybe, like when we get to a situation like now, many, many, many years later, almost 20 years later, 20 years after the end of the Civil War, 18 years after the first election, you start to have more accountability, right? And the accountability becomes much more meaningful. But you transition out of one space and into the next. So by no means would I ever excuse the atrocities that were done by these groups. And you can't call them warlords. You can call them sort of what you like. I think about warlords as, coming to take over and wanting really to take over the country. And I thought about these groups as really operating on a small scale and not really trying to take over the country. They just wanted to do business, and they needed to create a business environment in which they could thrive. And so that's what they did. So I would say that's, for me, the separation between this idea of what I call these extra legal groups and these warlords. Yeah.
There are very key things. I'll come to the state, the absence of the state, and the nature of the state in a minute. But I wanted to touch on that economics, the economic, when I think about Liberia, I'm thinking about Niger Delta in Nigeria, for instance, where the area is the oil-rich region in Nigeria, where the country had to fight insurgents group for the longest, and then the country then gave amnesty to these to thousands of these people in 2009, and then we've had relative peace in that region. But in that region, what I want to look at is, whilst some of the criticism of that is that what's happened is the whether you call them warlords, right, so you call them ex-combatants, the leaders of those groups have been rewarded, or if you use the word bribed, to be then the new elite, to provide the state with the access to that revenue, to that oil, to that resources without. So what is done is disincentivize the state from providing doing the fundamental thing like building roads or creating those same conditions exist. So it disincentivizes the state from doing that. And so what I want to look at is, should we, when you bring the spoilers, into such negotiation, does it in a way disincentivize the state, or does it is it counterproductive? Is the state better off dealing with the root cause of the problem? So in Liberia, for instance, George Weah lost because the people felt like the conditions were still the same. There's poverty, there's power shortage, all these things are still there. So how do you look at that in terms of how do you marry, how do you resolve that conflict in terms of like establishing peace by bringing in the spoilers and then addressing those fundamental needs, that structural conditions that also creates those need for those people to emerge?
Well, if you could answer that
Another tough question.
Another tough question. I mean, you basically solved all of the world's conflicts, Michael. So look, I think in all seriousness, that is, it is a really, really tough balance, no matter where in the world you're looking at. And sometimes you can see that where they get that balance wrong, you end up with one situation where the country goes back to war. You push a little bit too hard to take power away from the people who have it. And then in the other case, where you try to go for stability, and as you would say, you provide goodies, right? You provide bribes, you provide um, access to something that's very, very valuable. You provide them with some form of power, and you give that to the people who, I think from a normal person's perspective, should never be given that kind of power, given what they have done in the past, and they're being rewarded for being violent, right? So in one case, you have people being placated, you have ex-combatants or former fighters or militia groups or whatever, in the case of men in the Niger Delta, being placated. And then in the other case, you have, this kind of rooting out of corruption, trying to take that away from them and saying, look, you know what you've done is absolutely unacceptable. We are going to prosecute you, or we are going to go after everything that you've got. And in both cases, you go too far down one way and too far down the other. In one case, you get entrenched corruption, which is very, very hard to dig out, but you end up with a more peaceful situation. In the other case, what you're risking is a real return to war. And the difficulty is, how do you walk the line between the point where you can bring somebody in with you so that they're walking along with you and they say, okay, it's better for me to put down my weapons at this moment, and then to go with you and to take a little something. And I have now an incentive now to tell all of my followers and to tell all of the fighters within MEND to put down their guns. And then we all get something for a bit. But then you have to find a way back so that it doesn't end up with entrenched corruption. And it's very hard, so hard, impossibly hard to walk that line. On the other side, if you say, hey, look, we're going to fight you and you can't do this, and what you want is unacceptable, and then you just keep fighting and the violence continues, right? So that's one path. That's what could have happened if they didn't try to bring the war to an end. Or, even if, let's just say they end up in power for a while, and now the Nigerian state says, you know what, these people is not acceptable. Like, there's too much corruption going on. We're going to try and change the dynamic. We're going to try and change the situation here and make it less corrupt. Well, these people now have something to lose. If you try and take that away from them, the question is, can they remobilize, right? Are they able to call up their supporters and fight again? And if you think the answer to that is no, then you can try and, take some of that power back away from them. And if you think the answer is yes, then, you know, you don't do anything, because, the fallout from that is going to be possibly another return to war. So this is some of what we talked about in the Elite Bargains work, with the UK Stabilization Unit. And it's trying to walk that line. Um, and it's an incredibly fine line to walk. And I think a lot of countries get it wrong. They go for stability, and that completely makes sense. I think it's not just, the country that gets it wrong, it's the international community that gets it wrong. You look in Afghanistan, you can see the same thing. You look in Iraq, you can sort of see the same thing, that you want stability. And in order to create stability, you have to be able to give people an incentive to put down their arms. And in order to do that, um, oftentimes the people that you're placating, um, they don't want to do that unless they get something in exchange. And then how do you change that dynamic? It just becomes really, really, really hard. So that's, I think, the
I
dilemma
agree.
that you face.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's a very delicate line, and you've carefully and wisely responded to that. And it reminds me of another guest that was here a couple of weeks ago. Our professor, I don't know if you know him, Shedrick de Koning, and he's written about adaptive peace, and he's just said exactly what you said. You need to use the complex theory to approach this. So it's not something that you impose a particular structure of peace. You have to one that have to adapt. You have to the one that continuously adapt to the situation. So it's going to be one that's, from what you've said, it has to be one that looks at the different stages of the conflict and look at what can be done. Are they at the weakened position? Should we do this and then take away that popular support from the people? Because if the people don't support it, they might lose that, because I think in every conflict, in most conflicts, the having the people, supporting people, mobilization of the people is very key, because wherever these fighters come from, the people, from the society. So if you remove that condition that these people can capitalize on or exploit, it could, but it depends again on the stage of the conflict. But another key thing that you've said, which is very central, and also central to the work that I'm doing currently, is the state. It does look like the common denominator, the problem or the whole, is the issue of state legitimacy in the continent. So, and that state legitimacy comes from, it's very, very wide in terms of, like, is the state able to provide security for its citizens, is able to provide basic stuff. And like you said, the state is not much different from this group that are, and these groups are taking up that position of the state and acting in that capacity and challenging the state's legitimacy in that state. So how do you see, but in the case of Liberia has a different history from most or many other African countries. I think Liberia and Ethiopia has a very different history. So, but it still has the same symptoms. as the other history, other countries as well, in terms of like the same stressors, the same. So what is it? What is it? Is there why is that so? Considering it's different trajectory in terms of state composition, in terms of its independence and conduct. Why does it have the same? Why does it share? What similarities does it share with other states that have different, like colonialism and post-colonial states in Africa and that? And how do we
So
build? Yeah, go on.
no. It's a good question, and I think part of the answer is actually that Liberia is actually a lot more like the other states than people want to admit, and maybe that Liberians want to admit because of the way we talk about Liberia having and Ethiopia being the two states that have never been colonized, formally colonized. And I
Mm,
would say formally is an important word here because if you look at Liberia's history, I think it pretty much looks like it has been colonized. It's just that
mm,
we don't see it as clearly as that, and it's sort of it's a little bit more hidden um, to the outside viewer. But if you look at its past and how it came into being, it was I would say that it was colonized by the United States more or less, right? But the
mm,
story is
mm,
there is more complex because if you think about how Liberia was founded, it was quote unquote with freed slaves from America coming over and
mm,
then taking a piece of land. But they're talking about it as if that there was nobody there on that piece of land. And if you go
yeah.
back
Mm,
and read the history of what happened, there were battles that were fought over this land,
mm,
and there was
mm,
that land was taken with a gun being pointed at the head of I think it was King Long Peter at the time,
mm,
and it said, from the naval side there, and guns were a new thing, right? This was back in the
mm,
1800s. There was a gun
mm,
pointed at the chief's head and said, you better hand this over or else. And it also
mm,
came after a long period of trying multiple times up and down the Gold Coast, the West African coast, to try and find a place. And they were not given any land, and they were basically sent back actually multiple times. I think it was
mm,
only on the third time, and the Americans, for their own reasons, didn't want these freed slaves, right? For all sorts of their own political, domestic reasons. And then so
mm,
this time they were backed up by the Navy, and they came and they took over this land. And then the difficulty was holding on to this land. And that's why 156 or so of them from of all ages, like from children all the way up to grandmothers and grandfathers, had to fight this battle, and so they celebrate
mm,
it annually as part of their Independence Day, right? But
mm,
on the other side of that, from the Native Liberian side of that, from the existing tribes that were already there, they look at that day,
mm,
I think, very, very differently. And so, the way in which people think about Liberia, even from day one of the
mm,
formation of that country, is really mixed. It came from a place of violence for a lot of people, and
mm,
that's not really
mm,
recognized, right? So if you're
mm,
getting the freed slaves version of this versus the Native
mm,
Liberian story about this, on the one
mm,
side, it's a story of oppression, right? And on
mm,
the other
mm,
side, it's a story of a new homeland. And I
mm,
think the kind of if you go back and read the history of then, subsequently the ups and downs, Firestone ended up playing a very critical role. And then so did,
mm,
several times the Liberian state almost went bankrupt, and basically the US Senate and Firestone came in and provided a commercial out. But the quid pro quo of that
mm,
exchange was that the US was going to be a very powerful player in the country. And I don't
mm,
think that that is as well seen because it was done through a commercial enterprise. A lot of that power, you know, Firestone was basically the money upon which the Liberian government ran on. And without
mm,
Firestone, like the way in which the state developed in terms of the formation of the frontier force was incredibly brutal, and how it dealt
mm,
with native Liberians was incredibly brutal. So that's kind of relationship with the state. If you're thinking about why does that legitimacy not exist, it's because people were treated so horrendously in the past. and you have that trauma coming down, no wonder you don't trust the state, right? Who would trust the state, given how your grandparents were treated, taken away, and forced to work, in some cases, on some of these rubber plantations? Just, I think there's, that history between how the state treated some of these communities is incredibly brutal. Why would you trust the state? What has the state given us, right? But the people who benefited from the state, right? The quote unquote Congos, the people who were descended from the original American colonizers, right? The freed slaves. So they called them originally the American Liberians, and then later on they started calling them for the Congos. If the people who are associated with this class of people, somewhere between, depending on who you ask and how you count it, 2 to maybe 7 or 8% of the population, they had all of the benefits from the state. So the state worked really well for them. They got the scholarships, they lived well, they were able to go abroad. They often had dual citizenship between America and Liberia, and they would move back and forth between the two worlds. So if you are of that class, then life is good. And for the rest of the population, life isn't good. So that question about what you said about the legitimacy, well, it depends on who you are within this state. For some people, the state is incredibly legitimate. You have all of the power. You are the professors. You are the businessmen. You are the judges and the lawyers and the politicians in this society. And then for everybody else, you're nothing, right? And that's the difficulty, right? So who are you talking about having legitimacy for? And who are you within this state? So yeah, those are not nice answers there. But if you're thinking about
No, but
legitimacy, right, the legitimacy
yeah.
exists for some people and not for others.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. It's intriguing where you, like Riley said, depends on who you're speaking to. It depends on who you're asking. It depends on where people are in terms of what they're benefiting from the current, from the state. People that are benefiting from the way the state is would have a different view of it. But underlining all of these things, we can not notice the violent nature of
Yeah,
state formation
exactly.
in the continent.
Exactly. And
And that
and
va-
it was
yeah.
because you had asked me originally about, well, why doesn't Liberia have a different trajectory given that it hasn't been colonized? And my answer to you was that it sort of was colonized. And in fact, if you look at the patterns of behavior, it's just that the colonizers in this case were Black, so we don't think of them as being
Mm,
colonizers,
mm,
right?
mm,
But they
mm,
did not see themselves as the same, same
mm,
as we say in Liberia, as
mm,
the other
mm. Native
the native
yeah.
Liberians. Yeah, they saw
Mm,
themselves as basically better than everybody else. And
mm,
that they dressed differently. They treated themselves a class apart from the native Liberians who they saw as uncivilized. And so, in
mm,
one case we think about them as it's not possible because they were Black and they were freed slaves, they could ever, treat other people so horrendously. But what I learned out of studying Liberia so closely is
mm,
that you repeat the traumas that have been done unto you, that states do this and the people do this,
mm,
that if you know of a system, you tend to want to replicate that system. And they replicated the system
mm,
in many ways of slavery and having second class people, but they wanted to be the people at the top instead of the people at the bottom.
mm, mm,
um,
mm,
and so if back to your question, well, actually the trajectory of Liberia in many cases, it actually in practice has a lot of the same kinds of traumas amongst the
mm,
population that other countries would have experienced that had colonialism, the same kinds of traumas as
mm,
well. And I don't think
mm,
that excuses, I think things could have gone differently. And I think
mm,
there is always space for people to change the story of their
mm,
countries.
mm,
But these were some of the things that also happened to Liberia as well as in the neighboring
mm.
countries.
Interesting. If I come to the last question, I know it's going to be a very tough one. before I say country, in the last, let's say, 15 years, we've seen relative peace. We've seen peaceful transition to power. We've seen successive transition or transfer of power in Liberia. I don't think we've had one person that's had two terms in Liberia yet since 2005. I think Ellen Johnson had but I think she had two terms. Yeah, I think Ellen Johnson had two terms. Besides that, but in the last from the last election, we've not seen that. But if we look at that, we say, okay, there's been relative peace in the last coming to 20 years. So how can that peace be sustained? And you did mention something about the TRC that they tried, and how that didn't really had that effect. But if you look at the trajectory again, if you look from this base point of this last relative peace, what's the future? How can you predict the future of Liberia? So what would that be like? And then if you take a broad overview of the continent, just as the last question, what is the prospect of sustainable peace? What does it look like? How can we achieve that in Liberia and then in the continent as well?
So now you're asking me to solve African peace as well. Okay. Well, I'll try and provide a somewhat humble answer by saying I really don't know how to solve all of Africa's peace and conflict issues. But I can make some comments about Liberia just in terms of I actually think Liberia has done really, really well, and I just don't think we can. Um, I don't think we should take it for granted, right? So I think part of the difficulty when things go well is that people stop paying attention. And in order to continue for a place to go well, in order for a country to continue to sustain a peace that has been hard fought, is to keep paying attention to it. And in the case of Liberia, it's definitely having attention paid to it by both the international community and also by the United States, right? So those are the two, to a lesser extent, I would say the European Union, but really by the United States and by the UN. So as long as people have an eye on that country, and when I say an eye, I don't mean a coarse eye. It just means saying, hey, look, when there's a big corruption scandal, we're paying attention. And you sort of see this, right? That the US Treasury has put sanctions on 3 specific people. And part of why George Weah lost is because of a series
That
of
pressure,
corruption
yeah.
scandals. Yeah, right into his own government and being accused of turning a blind eye to those corruption scandals, right? So from his chief of staff and the solicitor general, right? Imagine having your solicitor general as somebody who's being accused of corruption and throwing away cases where in order to be for bribes to throw away the cases, that undermines confidence in your
in the
judicial
institution.
system. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's very, very hard, right? So, and I mean, to be honest, like most people weren't going to use the judicial system anyway because it's expensive. Most people can't afford it. Normal people can't afford it. So really only means which you actually fight something through the courts because it's expensive to do so relative to what people make. Um, and then, as you can see, it's seen as somewhat corrupt, right? If you can actually buy your way out of a case, difficult. And that's also something that I talk about in my book, right? That when you have a system where different there are different points of weakness uh, where people can be bribed or intimidated into changing the outcome, then that becomes a real problem of faith in your judicial system, and the people don't think about the courts as functioning. But maybe just as importantly, a lot of people don't have access to justice when bad things happen to them because they can't afford to go through the court system, or the police or the prosecution has a decision about the cases that they decide to prosecute, and not everybody will have justice done for them as a result of what the state decides. And so you end up with a system where, well, when bad things happen, what what recourse do you have? When people feel like there is no recourse, then they start turning to other means to exact revenge or to get back the things that they feel were stolen from them. And so, if there is a recommendation that I would make in thinking about Liberia, it is thinking about, well, how do you deal with those situations? It doesn't necessarily have to be with the courts, but normal people need to be able to access some form of non-violent, they need to have non-violent recourse. Um, and what sometimes that's done informally. If you're in different parts of rural Liberia, you'll have elders or chiefs try and do some of that. But for the bigger cases, the question is, well, how do you deal with that in a way that is peaceful? If people feel like they can have justice and they feel like they can have security, then maybe they will continue to use the ballot box and not resort to violence. And so far that has worked, right? So, but you can see, and I'll just think about South Africa here because that's a case that I followed for a really long time, watching it as a child and then watching how much it has changed, and then being in South Africa about 10 years after the end of apartheid and writing about it and seeing how hopeful it was and talking to people there, and now seeing how things have deteriorated, right? And how the hope that was there for a really wonderful and peaceful democratic transition where you saw more distribution from from white to black, frankly, and sharing of resources and the potential for Black people to be able to do well in that system, financially well, politically well, socially, occupying levels of status that they never dreamed of when I was a kid, right? When apartheid existed. And now you see what has happened. That doesn't happen quickly, right? From the age of Mandela um, out to Ramaphosa and so forth, like that change took a long time, and it happened through a slow deterioration of the institutions and a lot of corruption and um, a lot of people's loss of confidence in what the state was able to provide, and a continued and persistent level of deep dark violence, especially in a place like Johannesburg, where that kind of violence is just frightening, right? What people will do to you in order to, take a car or to come in and just kill people, having taken your things, kill you anyway, right? That kind of violence has persisted for such a long time, and the state has not been able to get a grip on it. If that kind of violence persists, then things start to fall apart over time. Um, you've seen this in lots of different places around the world. That's the worry, right? You don't let that kind of violence take root, and you have to try and, even though it's painful, root it out from the beginning. That's the thing that I would watch out for. And I would say, paying attention to across the continent, thinking about actually how corruption works in the society. That's the thing that makes people stop believing in the system. And then this kind of violence that is happening to normal people where you have no control over it. And then the criminals are allowed to get away scot-free without any kind of retribution, or able to intimidate their way out of prison or out of the courts or out of being dealt with, or just never being caught in the first place. That's the kind of thing that undermines faith, and leads to political instability in the long run. So I don't have any great answers for how to deal with it.
No, that is
I would just say
that is
that's what
more
you should
than
pay
that is more
attention
than
to.
that is yeah, that is more than great. What you said, it's more than great, and like you really say, it cuts across all of the other countries as well. And I've seen uh, similar stuff with other people I've spoken to. Is that faith institution, and the judiciary is very, very central to it. So we had another guest on the show that mentioned the judiciary in Nigeria. I said the judiciary is the bane of the problem in the continent. So the judiciary is an important institution where people, and you've said it also, it's not just the judiciary, it's also having access to it. People don't usually talk about that. If you don't have access to it, then you're frustrated and you can seek other means of, seeking redress to you. So it's been an amazing conversation, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation, Christine. And I'm grateful. It's early where you are in America, and then giving us this time, and we really, really appreciate your insights. We thank you for joining us today. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll see you back in London, Michael.
Yeah,
It's been an absolute pleasure.
See you soon. See you soon. Bye.
See you soon.
Bye. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in today to another exciting episode. That is Christine. Christine is an amazing friend, and someone that's got a lot of experience studying, researching, Liberia and other African countries, studying conflict. And I hope you've enjoyed this exciting video. Stay tuned for another episode. See you soon. Bye, and have a Merry Christmas.